Joining us in studio now for more is a regular guest on this I-24 News, Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and thank you for joining us in studio.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, predicting what may happen in a country like Afghanistan may be a bit of a fool's errand, but you certainly bring a lot more knowledge than most, if almost all. How do you think things are going to play out in Afghanistan as the U.S. and other Western countries pull their forces out?
I would say there are two options. Option one is that the Afghan government will prevail against the Taliban. They will fight them, bitterly fight them, and prevent them from taking over the whole of Afghanistan, particularly the cities. They have control of a lot of the rural areas now, but they don't generally have control of the cities. So that situation may be maintained. Option two is the Taliban will take over and will re-establish the kind of rule they had that we've heard about before they were thrown out by the Americans and other international forces. I don't think there's an option three where there's a peace deal between the two and they somehow live in peace and happiness ever after. That is just not going to happen with the Taliban. They want one thing only, and that is to impose their own version of harsh, brutal Sharia law over the whole country.
Well, given that, but also given the fact that this pullout became a consensus almost in the United States, first with the Trump administration, then it also adopted now by the Biden administration. We see it in other Western nations that just feel exhausted by the situation. Is this a mistake? Is there an alternative path that the U.S.-led coalition could have done something differently, or was that the road not taken too long ago?
It's a big mistake, I believe, to pull out now for a number of reasons. And what we should be doing is reinforcing our presence in Afghanistan.
Okay.
We should be increasing the troop numbers there, not to fight in the same way as we fought over many years, but to back up the Afghan National Security Forces. The fact that it's been going on for 2 decades does not mean it's ended.
Right.
If you just have to look at, let's say, the Korean War. The Korean War ended in 1948, whatever it was, in the 1950s.
It's in the 50s.
And there's still US forces deployed there today. The Second World War ended in 1945. There were US and other international forces deployed for decades afterwards in Europe. So the fact that it's been going on a long time does not mean it should necessarily end now. And the problem with it ending is that I believe the mission's been achieved all the way through for the last 2 decades. The mission, which was to stop Afghanistan from again becoming a safe haven to launch a 9/11 style attack, that has been achieved. By withdrawing now, that's an open question. It could well be that we have a situation where Afghanistan again attracts thousands and thousands of jihadists to go there and train and plan and meet and prepare to attack against the West. Also, it will mean, I think, a devastating situation for the Afghan people. And it will, I think, mean potentially large amounts of immigration out of Afghanistan, including into Europe, where there's already a big immigration problem. So I think these things are the consequences, among the consequences of this withdrawal now.
Right. Richard, let's listen to what UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had to say today about the Afghanistan pullout.
For obvious reasons, I will not disclose the timetable of our departure, though I can tell the House that most of our personnel have already left. I hope that no one will leap to the false conclusion that the withdrawal of our forces somehow means the end of Britain's commitment to Afghanistan. We are not about to turn away, nor are we under any illusions about the perils of today's situation and what may lie ahead.
Well, not the end of Britain's commitment to Afghanistan. We've heard similar statements coming out of Washington, but is this really just window dressing for a disengagement from Afghanistan by these countries?
I'm afraid I think it is. Yeah, I mean, I think they will try and maintain diplomatic missions there unless and until the Taliban fully take control, which is a possibility. They will retain small numbers of forces there to protect those diplomatic missions. But beyond that, of course, they could continue to provide aid and other forms of assistance to Afghanistan. But that would be obviously wasted if the Taliban took control. What they're doing, in effect, is leaving Afghanistan to the Taliban and leaving it to the other vultures that are circling. Iran, which has done huge damage to the Afghan government by its support to the Taliban. Pakistan, the same. China, which has been working hand in glove with the Taliban. These, and Russia, of course, which also has been working with the Taliban. So these countries will now be vying.
Well, let me move from that to some of the broader implications, strategic implications of this pullback by the West, by especially the U.S. and NATO forces. That, for example, could raise some concerns even here in Israel. As you said, countries like Iran, who have had a complicated relationship with the Taliban, could move in and have influence in that power void. But it also maybe raises concerns about a general pulling back of U.S. and Western influence in areas that are too problematic, including maybe here in the Middle East as well, something that we see in Iraq, maybe seeing in Syria, and of course sending a message to those other countries you mentioned, Iran and Russia in particular, which certainly would be concerned for this country.
President Biden's given us his reason for leaving Afghanistan so U.S. can focus more attention on confronting China and Russia. It's the opposite effect. As you rightly said, the message that's being sent by effectively abandoning Afghanistan is a message to China and to Russia of weakness, of U.S. weakness, but it's also, and I include not just U.S. but British as well.
Yeah, so and then NATO in general perhaps
right,
also.
Yeah, and so that encourages them. But what it does also is countries that have got to decide between siding with China and going along with Chinese ideas, or sticking beside the US or moving into the US sphere, they're going to wonder, is it worth us allying with the US when they behave like this to their allies? And the same could apply to Saudi Arabia. It could apply equally to the UAE and other countries in the Middle East who must be seriously concerned about the strength of the US relationship as it will exist under the Biden administration.
Right. Do you think if we see a situation where the Taliban do regain control over most of the country, they will allow it to become kind of a safe haven for terrorists? Maybe not on the scale of an Al-Qaeda, but to the situation where these countries, like the US and the UK, may have to re-engage and, in a sense, start from scratch and re-engage with Afghanistan?
I think it could well happen, and I'm sure they will continue as they have done ever since, not before 9/11 right. and since, to cooperate with Al-Qaeda, with Islamic State when appropriate, and it could present a major threat. Let's not forget that when President Obama withdrew all US forces from Iraq, that led directly to the rise of the Islamic State.
Right.
And eventually to the reinsertion of US and international forces into Iraq.
Right.
I think it's less likely to happen in the case of Afghanistan because people are scared to death of doing that.
Yeah.
But it's a possibility.
Right. One last country, Pakistan, you mentioned, intriguing how this would impact on that country.
Well, I think Pakistan will have benefited from this because Pakistan has always used the Taliban as a means of influence in Afghanistan, which it sees as strategically critical terrain for its purposes, for its defensive purposes against a potential Indian attack against Pakistan. But also it will be problematic for them because they will also have massive refugee problem entering Pakistan right. if the Taliban do succeed. And it will also potentially, because it emboldens jihadists everywhere, potentially lead to instability in Pakistan, which has its own international jihadist problems. So right. I think it's not good news for anybody, this situation.
Not good news for anybody, but let's keep us focused on the people who would suffer most, which is the Afghanistan people, especially the women of Afghanistan. That could be a humanitarian tragedy in the making just right there.
Absolutely. I mean, huge progress has been made by international forces and the Afghan government to liberalize Afghanistan in many ways, and that will all be lost and thrown away. And girls' education, women's rights, etc., I think will be significantly eroded.
Well, what a shame that would be to happen. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for joining us on I-24 News.